It is so good to be back in the YouTube swing of things and making another video for you guys. Now, I've gotten a ton of work done on this CJ over the last couple of months. It's time to take it to the next step and show you guys how to build rock sliders and bend tubing, saving you a bunch of cash on your project. Let me give you some updates. The last time that I actually made a YouTube video, it was a little bit ago. The back of the Jeep wasn't done. It didn't have a roll cage. The front didn't look like this. There were a lot of things that I did over the last couple of months that allowed me to get the Jeep looking like it does now. Now, I will do a complete comprehensive walk around of this vehicle here in another couple of months when it's actually completed and painted. But for right now, let me fill you guys in on what we've done. So the couple major things that were done here in the front was the completion of the front bumper. I basically took my 2x3 inch tube, kind of notched it off, put some angles in there, got myself some clevis mounts and a winch tray. The grill is hard mounted in there and the hood is now also mounted. I notched the hood out on both sides so that the coilovers could come through and everything sits beautifully at ride height. Now, I did get my Atlas transfer case mounted in here, and I also had to cut a hole here in the floor so that I could clock it, keep as much ground clearance on the bottom as possible. I used some of the pieces I took out to repair that, as well as made myself some new pieces to box it back in. That should all be contained underneath the seat, or at least almost completely under the seat once it's in here. But the floor is essentially done in here to the point where I can seal it and then put some bed liner on it. Now, the rear of the Jeep, that certainly didn't look like that the last time that you guys saw this thing. I had to make a little bit of a tunnel to clear my upper control arms at full bump, but that worked out nicely. I completed the stretch of the tub. We gave it an extra 5 inches in length. The coilovers are now mounted to the roll cage, and the roll cage is pretty complete and finish welded. Just a couple more small pieces that I'm gonna wind up putting in there to make it actually complete. I also finished the rear wheel wells with some custom corner armor. And that leads us to today's video, rock sliders. Now, you don't have to spend a lot of money on rock sliders, and they look the part. They serve as a step for you to get into your vehicle, but they're not really that tough. They dent real easily, they scratch real easily, or you can spend quite a bit of money on someone's rock sliders. These were made by a company that no longer makes them, but it's made out of DOM tubing. They're super, super strong. So I'm basically gonna make my own version of these today with my own affordable tube bender to show you guys how much money you can save by making your own rock sliders. They'll be super strong. You can put a custom flare on them if you want to. And this affordable bender right here is the only tool that I basically use to bend this roll cage behind me out of 1 3/4 DOM. So using some of the tips and tricks that I mentioned to you today will actually allow you to build your own sliders, but also set you up for success when it comes time for you to maybe do something bigger, like build your own roll cage. Now, this is the affordable bender. You can pick this up for about $400, and that includes one die of your choice. I have the die for 1 3/4. Now, I did spend an extra $100 and convert this to an air over hydraulic setup with a floor jack from Harbor Freight. I had to do some really basic modifications in order to actually fit that floor jack in there, but if you're bending your own tube and welding, you can certainly do those modifications. It's super simple. All I had to do was cut the carry handle off so it would fit in there, grind down the side just a hair so it was narrow enough to fit inside of the cage of the actual bender, and then I had to move this collar over. It was over here. I had to move it over just slightly and then drill a hole in it to mount it to the base plate. Now my air compressor operates this bender. I don't have to sit there and pump it 1,000 times. It'll bend 1 3/4 120 wall DOM without a problem, and it's much faster and easier. so the first thing that you are gonna have to do anytime you are doing a tube bending project is use the material, right? Whether it's DOM or electric welded, you have to use the material that you're actually gonna be doing your project out of. I'll get to why in a minute. You have to build a gauge piece. Now this gauge piece is bent to 90 degrees. And before I bent it, I marked it every inch with a Sharpie, right? Because you need to know what your cost of material is for the angle that you want to build, so you can figure out how long to make your pipe or your tube and minimize waste. This is a piece of DOM 120 wall. I'm going to mark my reference point. I'll show you that in just a minute. Every time in the same place. I marked it. You can see where the bend starts, where the bend ends. And then as I'm bending it, I marked 10 degrees. So when it got to 10 degrees, I put a line, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, all the way up to 90. Basically gonna mate it up and follow that same curve there. Now you can use an angle finder, but I already have the gauge, and it basically winds up being straight at about 40 degrees. I'm gonna come over here, I'm gonna line up where I want it to be. I got my bend at about 40 degrees, and I transferred a mark to the tape lining up with that 40-degree mark. To do the same thing on the back side. Now I'm going to measure between those two marks on the painter's tape to get a length. Now it's always a good idea to draw a plan out. So basically I have my two bends, I marked them at 40 degrees each, and in between where those bends end and it goes straight, I have it measured out at 47¼ inches. So now I'm going to go back to my gauge, and I know that if I'm measuring from 40 degrees, it's going to essentially use a certain amount of inches of material to make that 40-degree bend. I'm going to add that for both sides onto my 47¼ inches. That's exactly how long I need to make my tube. So I have my tubing cut at 67¼ inches because I had a 47¼ on the straight piece. I added 10 inches to either side. That gave me an extra 3 inches to play with length, make sure that I can get everything aligned up. But even if I cut that 3 inches off each side, it's only 6 inches of waste. It's really not that big of a deal. But at this point, we're gonna feed this into the bender. I'm gonna show you guys how to do that, how to set this guy up, and how to bend your first bend. So one of the first things that you're gonna have to do on your affordable bender is loosen your retaining ring. Once we do that, we can start sliding the tube in. Now guys, you want to lube everything up. I just hit it with a little WD-40, make sure everything rolls nice and easy. You can do that with your die as well, but you're basically going to slide the tube in from the back, send it in line with the die straight out the front. Now earlier I referenced a reference mark. That's the point at which you're going to insert your tubing into your bender and line it up on the die every time to keep your bends nice and consistent. I like to make my mark right on the edge of the die. So I know that my first reference mark to keep my tube at the right length and not waste anything is going to be 3 inches in on this side and 3 inches in on the far side. I'll use those reference marks to make my 40-degree bends. So I'm going to measure 3 inches in, make my mark. All of these tips and tricks are going to work on any tube bender that you're going to use, whether it's a JD squared or an affordable bender. Those are probably the two most popular. But like I said earlier in this video, just keep in mind that I was able to buy all of that roll cage tubing, plus the tubing for my sliders, plus the bender with a die for about the same price that it would have cost me to just buy a JD squared bender with a die. So puts you way ahead of the game, and now you have a bender for projects like this moving forward. With my airline hooked up and us being ready to go, we have to take the slop out of the die and then line it up. Now, if you guys look carefully, it may be hard to see on video, but if I push down on the back of the die, the way the die is going to move, you'll see it change up here in the front, and watch. See, you see that movement in there? You need to make sure that all that movement is out, and then that you take your reference mark and you line it up. You don't want that slop to adjust itself on your reference mark. And on the affordable bender particularly, I always like to take that extra few inches sticking out the front, because that allows us to measure our angle. So we're going to use a digital angle finder. I'm going to put it on the back of the tube and zero it out. That way we know that it's actually level. and then I'll shift it to the front. Now, something else we're gonna talk about is spring back. And that's why it's important to make that test piece at that 90 degrees with the material that you're gonna be using, because DOM, all steel, has what's called spring back. Now, when I bend it to 40 degrees and take it out of the bender, it won't be 40 degrees. It'll be more like 37 or 38. So all your material thickness, your material diameter, and the material you're using is going to change that degree of spring back. And making that test piece is a good way to learn as you mark every 10 degrees what the spring back is going to be. I know with this, I got to go 2 to 3 degrees past that 40 mark in order to actually have a 40-degree bend. Going to set this down. We will zero it out so that it knows the straight piece of tube is nice and square. And then we'll move it back up to where we measured our 40 from. And look at that, guys. That's definitely close enough to 40 for me. No one's going to notice a degree, let alone 0.3 degrees. Going to move on, do the same thing on the other side. So I have the tube back in the bender. And if you look at my reference mark, it's right there on the die, just like it was on the last one. But you'll notice that the center point of my die is not the center point of my reference mark. That is a super important step. When you are bending a piece of tube with matching angles that you want them on the same plane on both ends of that tube, you have to make sure that they're in the die correctly and not offset. Let me show you guys what I mean. Now, when I made the A-pillar and the roof line of my roll cage, I needed to make sure that this bend was in the right place regarding the firewall and the windshield. I needed to make sure it was at the right angle, and then I needed this bend to give me the right roof line, but it all needed to be on the same plane. This piece of tube needed to be bent perfectly so that they lined up. Because if this bend wasn't on the same plane, my roof line would have gotten skinnier as it went back or wider. And that is not what you're looking for. Similar to the back of the Jeep. If you take this tube, it goes straight up, has a bend on a different plane because it actually gets wider because I dovetailed the back of the Jeep and it goes up to that roof line. Then it bends back on a different plane the other way to go straight ahead and have those two bends that we just talked about. Now, those are easy to calculate because once you find the angle, you would just use your angle finder and say if it's a 45-degree angle that you want to make it offset, well, you would just put it in the bender square like it is right now and then rotate it 45 degrees and then bend. So it's pretty simple to do, but for this one, we want this bend and the other side to match perfectly. And that is what I like about the affordable bender. Being a vertical bender that bends everything in that vertical direction, it's real easy to slide your tube in and then line it up based on these two sides of the bender. And if you are perfectly in the center, then you know everything is square. All right, guys, so with that tubing bent, we're now on to basically making this straight piece of tube. And then we have to notch our ends and weld them together. Now, this straight piece of tube, we don't have to worry about this angle yet because we can rotate it after we weld in this straight piece. So all I'm gonna do at this point is basically take a measurement from where I want the end of my tube to go. I can cap it later. I'll basically measure that, and then find the same point on this tube across my two bends, and we'll cut that tubing. I'll notch these ends, and then we'll weld it together. We're time to start putting it on and figuring out our angle. It's not that difficult, and for time's sake in this video, I will not show you guys how to notch tubing. I will make another video just about how to notch tubing because you don't need to buy an expensive tube notcher. You can do it with a grinder, a Sharpie, and a tape measure. It is not difficult. It takes about 5 minutes, but that's what I'm gonna do here. So let me get that done. I'll be back with you in just a second. Well, guys, there is the beginnings of my slider. Now I notched my tube after the curve, put it in the end, and then I cut this straight tube just a touch long, but I did wind up cutting it off and making it flat and level on both sides. I'm just gonna cap the end with something, make it look kind of nice. And guys, we're gonna step back in. I'm gonna show you what I'm gonna do. I'm not gonna go through it all. I'm not gonna show you the details because it's pretty much gonna be different for every Jeep, especially this one because it has a custom frame, but I will let you know what the next steps are. And if you've made it that far, you basically have the basics, to bend some tube. Now, the notching, like I said, it'll be in a future video, but this rock slider, I gotta do the same thing on the other side. I'm gonna show you guys how I'm gonna mount it, what it's ultimately gonna look like. Now we have a couple of options here with the way that we're going to set it up before it gets attached to the frame. Now, I could leave it nice and flat, just like this. This inside edge here is gonna protect the rocker. It's basically underneath it. And then I could weld a piece of plate on there or even just leave it like that and it would serve as a nice step, as well as give it some protection off-road. But I think what I'm gonna do, just so it still kind of serves as a step, but I don't have to worry about the flat steel, so I'm gonna take it and tilt it up. That's gonna do a couple of things. That's gonna bring it closer to the body of the vehicle, so I'm not quite as wide down low. It's gonna give it a nice surface for rocks to rub on and slide off of underneath it. And then all I have to do to make sure that this is super strong is put a couple of pieces in here, you know, maybe 4 or 5 of them or so, basically connecting the outer tube to the inner tube. Then I'm gonna take a piece of steel, I'm gonna notch it, put it on here, run it straight over to the frame, make sure that has some gussets on it so it doesn't wanna bend around, especially where it might be longer in some areas. And I'm probably gonna weld it to the frame and attach it in 4 places. Now I know that's a lot. Most rock sliders only attach in 3 on a 4-door Jeep. This Jeep is a lot shorter, but like I said earlier, I plan on wheeling it extremely hard and I want these to take the abuse and last a good long time. So guys, I hope this video helps you and I hope it motivates you to maybe build yourself a set of rock sliders. You can make them look cool, you can add some plate, angle them, make them flat. There's a ton of different options. You can even put some different bends in your tubing. But ultimately, following these steps, making that bend, that 90-degree gauge and marking it will allow you to ultimately make roll cages and things like this with just a little bit of practice on your tube bender. But like I said earlier in this video, that bender is super cheap and it does a really good job, especially if you put that air over hydraulic jack on it. So that's what I recommend. That's what I'm doing. Guys, coming up on this rig, I'm gonna wind up showing you how to do a really awesome budget paint job that's going to be durable and it's going to look super, super cool. So stay tuned. A ton more videos are coming about this rig. Get out there, build something.